Non-stick pans are one of the most convenient kitchen inventions in history. They are a staple in 9 out of 10 American homes. The coating that makes them non-stick, a substance called polytetrafluoroethylene, marketed under the name Teflon, is so slippery that almost nothing adheres to it. Not eggs, not grease, not, it turned out, accountability. Because Teflon was made possible by a chemical processing aid called PFOA, also known as C8, and PFOA is one of the most persistent, most dangerous man-made toxins ever introduced into the human body. It does not break down, it does not leave. It accumulates in the blood, the liver, the kidneys, for a lifetime. And DuPont, the American chemical giant that manufactured Teflon and profited from it for more than half a century, knew this. They knew it in 1961. They knew it in 1981, when a baby boy was born with a deformed face to a mother who worked in their Teflon plant. They knew it in 1984, when their own scientists secretly tested drinking water downriver from their West Virginia factory, found it contaminated with PFOA, convened a meeting at corporate headquarters in Delaware, and chose to keep using twice as much. They knew it when 70,000 Ohio River Valley residents were drinking it for decades without their knowledge. They knew it when the cattle started dying and the cancer rates climbed, and a small-town lawyer named Rob Bilott started asking questions they had spent 50 years making sure nobody would ask. What DuPont did was not a series of oversights. It was a strategy. Contaminated water supplies, suppressed internal studies, a science panel that found PFOA probably linked to 6 diseases, including kidney cancer and testicular cancer, a spin-off company created specifically to absorb the legal liability, and a settlement of $670.7 million that amounted to less than 1 year of Teflon revenue. PFAS chemicals, the class that PFOA belongs to, are now detected in the blood of 99% of Americans. The EPA set its first ever drinking water limits for PFAS in April 2024, 80 years after DuPont first started using the compound. And the chemical that replaced PFOA in your non-stick pan was designed by the same company, approved through the same process, and is already turning up in the same places. This is the story of DuPont and the disturbing business of non-stick pans. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to a spring morning in April 1938, inside a laboratory on the banks of the Delaware River in Deepwater, New Jersey. And you have to understand the man standing in front of a gas cylinder that refused to discharge. His name was Roy Joseph Plunkett. He was 27 years old. He had grown up poor, the son of an Ohio farming family who came of age during the Depression. The poverty of his childhood would give him an almost stubborn work ethic, the kind that keeps a scientist at a bench long after other people have gone home. He had put himself through Manchester College in Indiana, earning a chemistry degree in 1932. He would go on to Ohio State University for a master's and then a doctorate, graduating in 1936. He would be hired by DuPont that same year, assigned to their Jackson laboratory in Deepwater, New Jersey. His roommate at Manchester, a young man named Paul Flory, would eventually win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for his contributions to polymer science. Roy Plunkett would not win the Nobel Prize, but what Roy Plunkett would find in that cylinder on the morning of April 6, 1938, would change the world in ways that Plunkett himself could never fully anticipate. Plunkett and his laboratory assistant, Jack Riebock, were running experiments on new refrigerant gases, substances meant to replace the poisonous sulfur dioxide and ammonia that had been leaking into homes and factories and killing people for decades. It was, in that sense, work done in the spirit of safety. Plunkett had prepared a cylinder of tetrafluoroethylene gas for the experiment. When he opened the valve, nothing came out. The cylinder should have been full. By every measurement, it was the right weight, but no gas discharged. A lesser scientist might have set it aside. Roy Plunkett cut the cylinder open. Inside, he found a white, waxy, powdery residue coating the cylinder walls. The tetrafluoroethylene gas had, against all prevailing predictions of polymer science, polymerized inside the container. It had transformed itself into something else entirely, something nobody had ever intentionally made and nobody had expected to find. Plunkett tested it. It was extraordinarily resistant to heat. It was chemically inert. Almost nothing would react with it. It had one of the lowest coefficients of surface friction ever measured in a solid material. Virtually nothing would stick to it. He had discovered polytetrafluoroethylene, which DuPont would trademark under the name Teflon. What makes Roy Plunkett sympathetic, genuinely sympathetic, not just strategically so, is that he did not discover this substance in pursuit of profit. He was following the logic of chemistry because that was what he did. He was a methodical, precise, quietly brilliant man who kept meticulous laboratory notebooks, who credited his assistant Jack Reebok in every account of the discovery he ever gave, who expressed wonder rather than ambition when describing what he had found. He would later say, with characteristic modesty, that the discovery was really a matter of being in the right place at the right time with his eyes open. He was the kind of scientist who treated an anomaly not as an inconvenience, but as an invitation. DuPont, not Plunkett, filed the patent. DuPont, not Plunkett, would own what came next. Roy had no idea that the substance in that cylinder, slippery, stable, seemingly inert, would one day be found in the blood of nearly every person alive. DuPont moved quickly. The commercial potential of PTFE was obvious from the earliest tests. It resisted everything. It was stable at temperatures that would destroy conventional plastics. It could be used as a lubricant, a sealant, a coating, a lining, anywhere that required a material that would simply refuse to react with the world around it. The first significant application would not be cookware. It would be war. The Manhattan Project, the United States program to develop atomic weapons, required materials that could withstand extreme chemical corrosion. The uranium enrichment process for the bomb produced highly corrosive fluorine compounds that would eat through nearly any conventional container or seal. Teflon would not be destroyed. It would be used to coat the gaskets and valves and seals that made the gaseous diffusion process possible at Oak Ridge and Paducah and Hanford. The substance discovered by a young chemist in a routine refrigerant experiment would become a literal component of the device that ended the Second World War. Whatever else you might say about DuPont, you cannot deny that they understood what they had. Teflon was trademarked in 1945. By the early 1950s, DuPont would be supplying PTFE to the aerospace industry, to electrical engineers who needed wire insulation that could survive intense heat and cold, to industrial facilities that needed non-reactive linings for storage tanks and chemical processors. NASA would use it in spacesuits and in equipment aboard the early satellites. The material that had emerged from a failed refrigerant experiment would end up touching nearly every corner of modern industry. Another stroke of genius in commercialization, even if DuPont had not exactly invented it so much as capitalized on it. But the application that would make Teflon a household name was still in the future, and it would come not from a DuPont laboratory, but from a kitchen in France. In the early 1950s, a French engineer named Marc Gregoire was using PTFE to coat his fishing tackle to prevent it from tangling. His wife, Colette, had an idea. If it prevented the fishing line from sticking, could it be applied to a cooking pan? Marc Gregoire would go on to develop a method for bonding PTFE to aluminum that nobody had managed before, patenting the process in 1954. 2 years later, he and Colette would found the Tefal Corporation, a contraction of Teflon and aluminum. Marc believed in his invention so completely that when no established manufacturer would produce it, he made the pans himself and sold them on the street. He would sell 1 million in the first year. By December 1960, Tefal's non-stick pans had reached American stores. Within months, retailers were ordering 1 million pans a month. A photograph of First Lady Jackie Kennedy holding a Tefal pan would provide the kind of endorsement that no advertising budget could have manufactured. By the mid-1960s, the non-stick pan was a fixture in American kitchens, priced affordably enough that you would find it in households at every income level. The pan had genuinely democratized a certain kind of cooking. You could fry an egg without butter. You could make crepes without grease. You could cook fish and wipe the pan clean in 30 seconds. This was, by any honest measure, a useful invention. Another stroke of genius from a product that nobody had set out to create. DuPont, licensing the Teflon trademark and supplying the PTFE, became the indispensable industrial backbone of the revolution. To manufacture Teflon at commercial scale, they needed a processing aid, a chemical emulsifier that would allow PTFE particles to be dispersed evenly and applied smoothly to surfaces during manufacturing. That chemical was perfluorooctanoic acid, PFOA-C8. DuPont began purchasing it from 3M in 1951 and would eventually become the only American manufacturer of the compound after 3M exited the market. In 1961, Dorothy Hood, the chief of toxicology in DuPont's Polychemicals Research and Development Department, evaluated the toxicity of Teflon dispersing agents on laboratory rats. Her internal report found that Teflon materials had the ability to increase the size of the liver of rats at low doses. Liver enlargement was identified as the most sensitive sign of toxicity. Hood recommended that all of these materials be handled with extreme care and that contact with skin be strictly avoided. The report was marked confidential. DuPont noted the findings, and DuPont kept using PFOA. The Teflon brand, meanwhile, kept growing. By the 1980s, the word Teflon had entered the cultural vocabulary at a level most trademarks never achieve. When Democratic Congresswoman Pat Schroeder rose on the House floor in 1983 and called Ronald Reagan the Teflon president, because nothing stuck to him, it was understood immediately by every American who heard it. DuPont's lawyers were reportedly irritated only that journalists kept omitting the trademark symbol. The company had built something worth more than any single patent, a brand so embedded in everyday life that its name had become a synonym for invulnerability. The Teflon president governed in the same decade that DuPont was quietly testing the drinking water of the communities that surrounded its Teflon plant and telling those communities nothing. There was a dark irony in that metaphor that nobody inside DuPont seemed troubled enough to address. Up to now, DuPont looked like an American success story. The accidental discovery of a brilliant young chemist, commercialized by a company with the resources to see its potential, adapted by a French engineer into a product that transformed the daily lives of ordinary people. A billion-dollar business built on something that started as a frozen residue inside a laboratory cylinder. But here is where the story takes a much darker turn. Because what DuPont decided to do next, and kept doing for another 20 years, was not just negligent. It was a choice. The 1961 toxicology report had planted a seed. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, DuPont continued accumulating internal data on PFOA. Animal studies showed the chemical accumulating in blood, in liver tissue, in kidneys. It was not metabolized. It did not break down. It simply stayed. Internal studies would document reproductive toxicity in animals. Memos would circulate within DuPont's medical and toxicology departments discussing the implications. And still, the company would say nothing to the workers handling PFOA daily at the Washington Works plant in Parkersburg, West Virginia, which had been manufacturing Teflon since 1951. Then came 1981. 2 out of 7 pregnant women working in DuPont's Teflon unit at the Parkersburg plant would give birth to babies with birth defects. DuPont's medical department documented the cases in a confidential memo dated March 1981. One of those babies was named Bucky Bailey. He was born with only one nostril, a deformed eyelid, and a keyhole-shaped pupil in his right eye. His condition was so severe that physicians warned his mother he might not survive more than a few hours after birth. His mother, Sue Bailey, had been a full-time employee in the Teflon division throughout her pregnancy, working in conditions where PFOA exposure was daily and documented. A secret internal document created shortly afterward would show that DuPont officials knew 2 out of 8 babies born to female employees at Parkersburg had eye defects. DuPont's internal study identified a possible link between maternal C8 exposure and the birth defects. DuPont's response was to quietly move all women of childbearing age out of the Teflon division. They paid Sue Bailey a settlement, and they told no one else. No other workers were informed. No regulators were notified. Bucky Bailey's face would require multiple surgeries to correct. The data went into a confidential file, and DuPont kept making Teflon. 3 years later, in 1984, DuPont went further. Company scientists conducted a covert water sampling program, sending staffers into general stores, markets, and gas stations as far as 79 miles downriver from the Parkersburg plant, asking to fill plastic jugs with tap water. The tests came back positive. PFOA was in the drinking water of Little Hocking, Ohio, a small community just across the Ohio River from the Washington Works plant. The residents of Little Hocking did not know. The water utility did not know. The state of West Virginia and the state of Ohio did not know. DuPont knew, and DuPont held a meeting at its Delaware corporate headquarters. At that meeting, executives reviewed their options. They could stop using PFOA. They could reduce production. They could invest in abatement technology to limit contamination from the plant. Or they could continue with no changes. DuPont chose to continue, not just continue. They chose to use twice as much PFOA. The covert water sampling program would continue internally through at least 1989. The community would drink that water for another 18 years before anyone told them what was in it. This was not a corporation that stumbled into harm through ignorance. This was a corporation that gathered evidence of harm with scientific precision, filed it under the word confidential, and made a deliberate decision to proceed. DuPont was not merely a cookware supplier. By the 1980s and the 1990s, it was the most profitable chemical company in the United States, a vertically integrated enterprise that controlled everything from raw material production to consumer marketing. PFOA was not a trace contaminant or an accidental byproduct. It was a deliberate industrial tool, central to DuPont's highest revenue product line. In the mid-2000s, DuPont would disclose to the SEC that Teflon-related revenues were approximately $1 billion per year. After 3M phased out PFOA production in 2002, DuPont became the only American manufacturer of the compound. They owned the science around it. They owned every decision about what the rest of the world would be allowed to know. And those decisions would not be made by Roy Plunkett. Plunkett had retired from DuPont in 1975. He would die in May 1994, never knowing the scale of what the compound he accidentally discovered would be used to enable. Roy Plunkett was long gone from this story before its darkest chapters were written. The decisions would be made by legal teams and corporate communications departments and the executives who attended the 1984 meeting and chose silence. The villain in this story is not a person. It is a machine, the institutional apparatus of a corporation that had learned to treat human exposure as a liability category rather than a harm to be stopped. DuPont's lawyers held internal workshops on how to avoid creating a paper trail regarding C8's effects on human health. When the EPA sent a formal request in June 1997 for all known toxicological information about PFOA, DuPont responded without including the 1981 data on transplacental transfer, the finding that PFOA crossed the placenta in pregnant workers, the data directly relevant to what had happened to Bucky Bailey's mother. That omission would later be confirmed by the EPA as a violation of the Toxic Substances Control Act's mandatory substantial risk reporting requirements. The EPA would fine DuPont $16.5 million in 2005 for TSSE. Violations related to PFOA, at the time the largest administrative penalty ever assessed under the Act. By the 1990s, 70,000 residents of the Ohio and West Virginia communities surrounding DuPont's Parkersburg plant had been drinking PFOA-contaminated water for years. DuPont's legal strategy, sustained across decades, was to delay, to obscure, to manage individual cases quietly, and to count on the gap between what the company knew and what anyone outside could prove remaining wide enough to operate within. They had run the same play for 30 years. They did not count on Rob Bilott. Now let us walk through what actually happened, piece by piece, in order, because the accumulation is what matters. In 1998, a West Virginia cattle farmer named Wilbur Tennant contacted an environmental attorney in Cincinnati, Ohio, named Robert Bilott. Tennant's cattle had been dying, not one or two, but more than 150 animals, documented over several years. They were found with black teeth, emaciated bodies, lesions on their organs, tumors. Some cows were giving birth to calves with green slime in their mouths. Others were found dead near the creek that ran along Tennant's property, which flowed downstream from a DuPont-owned landfill called Dry Run. Tennant had filmed the evidence himself. He had brought the videos to state environmental agencies and received no meaningful response. Rob Bilott was a corporate defense attorney. He had spent his career representing chemical companies, not litigating against them. He took the Tennant case partly through a professional connection, and partly because the documented pattern of animal deaths was unlike anything he had encountered. In 1999, Bilott filed a federal lawsuit against DuPont. As part of that litigation, he obtained a court order compelling DuPont to produce all relevant documents. DuPont sent him 110,000 pages. Buried in those pages was a chemical name Bilott had never heard: perfluorooctanoic acid, C8. As Bilott read through the internal memos, the toxicology reports, the meeting minutes, the confidential studies spanning 5 decades, the picture assembled itself with the particular clarity of evidence that has been carefully organized even while being deliberately kept secret. DuPont had known the chemical was toxic in animals since 1961. They had documented its transplacental movement in pregnant workers since 1981. They had confirmed it was in the drinking water of downriver communities since 1984. They had run internal studies, generated findings, circulated memos, and kept all of it inside. What DuPont had not anticipated in sending those 110,000 pages to a Cincinnati attorney in 1999 was that he would be willing to spend the next 20 years of his professional life making sure that knowledge went somewhere it could not be taken back. In 2001, Bylot filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of approximately 70,000 residents of the Mid-Ohio River Valley, whose drinking water had been contaminated by DuPont's Parkersburg plant. The resulting settlement included something unusual. DuPont agreed to fund an independent scientific panel, the C8 Science Panel, composed of epidemiologists who would examine the health records of that exposed community over 7 years. The panel would ultimately establish a probable link between PFOA exposure and 6 diseases: kidney cancer, testicular cancer, thyroid disease, ulcerative colitis, elevated cholesterol, and pregnancy-induced hypertension. These were documented elevated rates in real people compared against populations without comparable PFOA exposure. Health researchers examining the kidney cancer data found rates among residents with high C8 exposure were between 20 and 60% higher than in lower exposure groups. For testicular cancer, the elevated risk ranged between 80 and 170%. These are not rounding errors or statistical artifacts. These are people who drank water that DuPont had secretly tested in 1984, found contaminated, and said nothing about for 18 years. Now, the dirty math. DuPont earned approximately $1 billion per year from Teflon-related revenues at the compound's commercial peak in the mid-2000s. The company had been producing and selling Teflon products since the early 1950s, a commercial lifespan of more than 50 years. Even conservatively, across the full period that PFOA was used as a production aid, the financial return ran into the tens of billions of dollars. The total settlement paid by DuPont and its spin-off Chemours to resolve approximately 3,500 personal injury cases in the multi-district litigation was $670.7 million, announced in February 2017. At Teflon's peak annual revenue rate, that settlement represents less than 9 months of income. For 50 years of documented concealment of a cancer-causing contaminant in the drinking water of tens of thousands of people, DuPont paid less than 1 year of what the product earned them. They profited for 50 years. They settled for 8 months. Do that arithmetic slowly. Here is the second number. When DuPont formally spun off its performance chemicals division into a new entity called Chemours in July 2015, DuPont had estimated its maximum legal exposure in the pending PFOA personal injury litigation at approximately $128 million. 19 months later, the actual settlement came in at $670.7 million, more than 5 times DuPont's internal estimate. Chemours subsequently sued DuPont, alleging that DuPont had deliberately underestimated those liabilities when structuring the spin-off, transferring them to Chemours without adequate disclosure. The dispute would eventually resolve through a $4 billion cost-sharing agreement between DuPont, Chemours, and Corteva. The spin-off that was designed to contain the liability became its own multi-billion-dollar reckoning. The math had a way of arriving regardless of how long you delayed it. By the time the individual trials began in 2015 and 2016, the scale of what DuPont had hidden was no longer in question. In 2016, a jury would find DuPont liable for the kidney cancer of Carla Bartlett, awarding over $1.5 million. In 2017, a second jury would award $83 million to David Freeman, who had developed testicular cancer after years of drinking PFOA-contaminated water near Parkersburg. The Freeman verdict was seen as a signal of what the full trial pool of remaining cases might cost. The $670.7 million global settlement followed in February 2017. Both DuPont and Chemours denied wrongdoing. DuPont had phased out C8 by 2013 under EPA pressure. The company replaced it with a newer fluorochemical called GNX, formerly designated HFPODA, which Chemours began manufacturing at its Fayetteville, North Carolina facility. GNX would be found discharging into the Cape Fear River, the drinking water source for communities including Wilmington. The April 2024 Environmental Protection Agency drinking water regulations would specifically name GenX as one of 6 PFAS chemicals requiring enforceable maximum contaminant levels. The same company, the same basic chemical architecture, a newer name, and already accumulating downstream. Now consider where you are, not Parkersburg, not Little Hocking, wherever you live. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has detected PFAS chemicals in the blood of 99% of Americans tested, not residents of known contaminated areas specifically, not industrial workers with documented exposure histories, but the general American population. PFAS have been found in Arctic snow, in Antarctic ice, in remote rainwater collected thousands of miles from any known industrial source. They have been found in the blood of newborn babies, transferred from mother to child across the placenta, the same pathway DuPont documented internally in 1981 and did not disclose to regulators for more than 20 years. The U.S. Geological Survey has estimated that at least one PFAS compound is detectable in close to half of all tap water systems in the country. More recent Environmental Protection Agency testing data suggests that as many as 176 million Americans drink water with detectable PFAS levels. The non-stick pan on your stove right now almost certainly does not contain PFOA. The major manufacturers phased it out after the Environmental Protection Agency consent agreements that followed Rob Bilot's work. But the pan you own was almost certainly coated using a fluorochemical that replaced PFOA, a newer compound developed under less scrutiny, with a shorter regulatory history, and with the same fundamental chemistry. The box may say PFOA-free. It will not tell you which compound replaced PFOA, or who manufactured that compound, or what the manufacturer's internal studies currently show about its long-term effects. The marketing has updated, the transparency has not. The chemical that replaced PFOA in your pan was designed by the same company that concealed PFOA's effects for 50 years, approved by the same general regulatory framework that DuPont spent decades running circles around, and is already showing up in the same places, in your water, in your blood, in your children's blood. The pan sitting on your stove right now almost certainly does not contain PFOA. But the story of the coating that replaced it is still being written, and the company writing it has a documented history of keeping the interesting parts confidential. What DuPont's story reveals is not simply corporate greed, though greed is certainly present in large and documented quantities. It is a demonstration of something more systematic and more durable, the ease with which a sufficiently large institution can separate knowledge from consequence. DuPont knew. The evidence is not in dispute. It is in the documents, in the memos, in the minutes of the 1984 meeting, where executives reviewed the evidence of contamination and chose to double their PFOA usage rather than stop it. The company knew what it was doing to the people downriver. It knew what it was doing to the women who worked in its Teflon units, to Bucky Bailey's mother, to the 70,000 residents of the Ohio River Valley drinking contaminated water without their knowledge or consent. It knew, and it calculated that the cost of knowing was manageable as long as the knowledge stayed inside. Rob Bilott spent 20 years fighting to move that knowledge outside. He won, eventually, in the way that attorneys win, through verdicts and settlements and regulatory consent agreements and a 20-year siege of a company whose legal budget dwarfed his entire practice. But by the time the verdicts came and the settlements were signed, the chemical was already everywhere. In the Arctic, in the Antarctic, in the umbilical cord blood of newborns who had never been near Parkersburg. The thing that got out was not a secret. It was a substance. And a substance, once it enters the water supply, does not wait for a verdict to reach the people downstream. The disturbing thing about non-stick pans is not just what was in them. It is how long we trusted the label. And that is the thing about the things you own. They almost always cost more than the price on the tag.